how you should show up on the internet and what the best way is to use social platforms as someone who uses them for a job. Unstructured research time, when you are simply scrolling, you're not doing anything at all. Before we even start making content, we want to understand who that content needs to apply to. If you don't know who's on the platform, you're not going to know strategically when to start advertising or posting on that platform. There's like so much demand for our attention as marketers. We want to make sure we're doing the right work and the right research. And part of that, again, is making sure that we're on the right platforms.
I love working with Pilot House because while we are a performance marketing agency, we really pride ourselves on caring so much about brand and creative. At Pilot House, we don't just make ads, we craft them. Every edit, every word, every scroll-stopping detail is built with purpose and care, and I truly believe that care drives creativity and creativity drives results. Our attention to both scale and brand allows us to craft strategies that deliver you short-term results while making you long-term successful, which is so important for any DTC brand. If you are curious about learning more about working with Pilot House, you can fill out a lead form at pilothouse.co and let them know you want to go on a brand new ad venture. You don't actually have to say that. You don't have to make a pun. I'm not going to force you to make a pun. Just fill out the lead form. We'd love to chat with you.
Hi, welcome back to Ad-venturous, the podcast produced by DTC and hosted by me, Aves. Today, I wanted to start us off with what I think is a funny story, which is that once I was a teenager and I took a book out from the library on moral philosophy, and I never returned it or paid any fees related to losing that library book. I think I might have left it at a cafe or something. I don't know. It did not end up in my possession, but I always have just thought that was really funny. To lose and then not pay for a book on moral philosophy as a teenager is it's an interesting course of events to unpack from the point of view of kind of any school of thought around moral philosophy. But I do want to say also, I went to the library after I lost that book and they never said anything about it. I'd be more than happy. I love public libraries. I think they are the bee's knees and a pillar of society. So please, Vancouver Island Regional Library, if you're listening to this, send me a bill. I would love to pay for that book. But yeah, I was reading a book not too long ago, as I'm one to do, about feminist theory, and I was reintroduced to standpoint theory, which is a framework which basically argues that those in particular communities are more able to construct a wider viewpoint of the world. So essentially, the idea is that the more social groups an individual belongs to, the more robust view they're going to have of society as a whole. That is a really simplified version of what standpoint theory is. I'm not a huge subscriber to standpoint theory because I think we get into a zone where we're talking about what is accurate or real information and knowledge. But I do see it as someone who is a woman and also a woman of color. I see how it does make sense a little bit. You can just understand more points of view when you belong to different marginalized groups. That makes sense to me. But I've been thinking a lot about standpoint theory in the context of what most of us do, which is kind of living online a lot. When digital marketing is your job, or any form of brand today is your job, if you are a DTC founder, however you touch e-commerce, you spend a lot of time online. And so I've been thinking a lot about layering standpoint theory into some separate thoughts I've been having about how you should show up on the internet and what the best way is to use social platforms as someone who uses them for a job. I think this is something that all of us maybe think about a lot, or maybe I just love to ruminate. I don't know. Let me know in the comments if you've ever really considered what you should be doing online and how you should ethically show up on platforms. But it's yeah, we spend so much time online already as part of our jobs that I often have, in the past at least, struggled with trying to find a balance of professional and personal use of different platforms. And so I think it is really interesting to, again, contextualize what I've sort of maybe told you a little bit about standpoint theory, and this idea of belonging to different groups online makes you a more robust, I think, person and a more interesting marketer. And that's just my opinion. It's not a fact. That's just a thought I've started to have. But I thought it'd be really cool this episode to talk about different ways to use social media. Also, I always feel like a boomer when I say social media. I think it's like, I don't know, icky. But yeah, like how should we use these platforms? What is like the best way? And I also wanted to just talk about my own personal experiences with like using them in both personal and professional ways and what I've learned from a really weird journey, I guess, with using social media. So I thought I'd segment this into sort of 3 separate categories, which is kind of cute because standpoint theory actually is sort of built up by 3 main theses, which kind of is being echoed in this episode. That's a real like deep cut Easter egg reference for anyone who loves like social thought theory and also podcast episode building. I don't know. I think maybe I'm the only person who would find that interesting. But anyway, I wanted to start by talking about like personal use of social media and posting and like how I view a lot of my colleagues and network using these tools and how I've been using them myself. And then after that, we're going to talk about like sort of scrolling to gather inspo, which I feel like a lot of social media managers and people who live in our sort of content realm, you kind of fall down a little bit of a rabbit hole doing this. So I wanted to, again, talk about some like benefits, some tips and tricks on how to best actually do that online, and also share some like personal insights from things that I found from experimenting over the years. And then the last chunk of the episode, we'll talk about targeted persona research and just how to be savvier and really be part of those different communities. Because like I mentioned, I think standpoint theory is really interesting if we water it down and apply it to a digital marketing lens, which is the more sort of niche groups and communities you're a part of on the internet, the better you're going to be able to show up as a marketer. And I think this last chunk where we're talking about really targeted persona research is going to help you kind of figure out how to start going about that work. Okay, first pillar that we're going to talk about, like I mentioned, is personal use and just like posting online as someone who works in the industry. I think like something that people used to like to hear about me is that I didn't have any owned social accounts for like 7 years. As a teenager, I had a couple of different accounts with like quite a few followers, spread out amongst like Twitter, Tumblr. Shout out to Tumblr. If you're on Tumblr, you are probably really good if you work in the content space, I have to say. But I also had quite a few followers on Instagram as well. And I was just sort of doing those things, enjoying it for a while. But then I did stop because I was starting to work on the sort of like political strategy side of things. I was starting to really work with these tools and realize how useful they were to people and how much data I was putting out there. And I realized also that I was just very young and I was really shy. And the concept all of a sudden of having so many different eyeballs on me and also having people being able to like access me in a way and how I thought about the world and thought about myself, I really didn't like it. Like I mentioned, I was in my late teens, sort of early 20s at that point, and I really realized that there's just like a little nugget in me, and I was like, I wanted to figure out who I was, really autonomously of the world and any sort of expectation. So that's why I got offline, but I never stopped working in the field, which I think is really important. So I really stayed up to date on everything that was going on, trends, all of that stuff. But I stopped posting. I deleted all of my accounts for everything. And I live totally offline. I have to say, if you're interested in doing this, it's not that hard and it's actually really cool. I loved being like totally offline for so many years. You really do have to make an effort when it comes to communication and like keeping up with your friends, but I don't think that's a bad thing. And you also have to be ready to like not be a part of every single thing, because something I would find would be like, sometimes I would miss like a niche meme or something, especially when I was working in politics and I didn't have to be so entrenched in like actual content inspo. So sometimes you'll miss out on a joke. There might be like a messenger group chat that you're not part of that someone sends a funny picture in. And so you have to be really comfortable with sometimes like being on the outside of things and asking for an explanation in social settings. But yeah, I didn't find it had any negative impact on any of my friendships. I think it actually really strengthened a lot of my friendships. And like I mentioned, it was just like cool to be offline. I feel like it was like a real humble brag when I used to tell people. And then only in the past few months since launching the podcast have I started like actively posting on any platforms. So today I started posting on LinkedIn, which is kind of a really weird one to start with after like a decade. And then also TikTok, which has been really fun. And something that I have found on like a personal anecdote side is like I do really enjoy the actual social part of social media. I've had a really good time like meeting friends and having mutuals and commenting on their stuff and them commenting on mine and like sending each other TikToks. That's been a really fun experience for me. And I also think it's allowed me to sort of paint with more colors. So, getting into the benefits of posting online, if you work in the e-commerce space and you're posting online in a personal way, I think for me, I've always been someone who really values being multidisciplined in every facet of my life. I grew up around a lot of people who shared the same like excitement around that sort of multifaceted ideal setup. So I think that what it really brings is like almost a space to create in a different way, which I have found in the past few months has helped me like brainstorm and be able to create content for brands at a much quicker pace because I'm doing it in different ways. So I'm not always thinking about the brands I'm working with and always thinking about the type of content I want to make for them. I am like flexing the muscle in a different way and strengthening it, which I think is always a really good thing. So yeah, it's like sometimes I will do something on my personal TikTok and think like, that was kind of funny, or like that got a fair amount of engagement. Maybe I'll try to think of a way to spin this for a brand and sort of vice versa. And so that's been like the main benefit, I think. The number one cost would definitely be that it's sometimes difficult to separate the two. I am not someone who really believes in like personal brands. I think that is like one of the weirdest, craziest things to say, that you have a personal brand. I don't really think I do. Maybe fart jokes could be my personal brand, but that's not even really a brand. But yeah, people who think a lot about a personal brand, I think will really struggle if they start posting online and like showing up as themselves. Because I think if you're used to doing it as a brand, like there are a lot of considerations I make when I am creating content on behalf of a brand. I'm thinking about different personas, I'm layering in product considerations, I'm thinking about the overall sort of mosaic of content spread across different platforms. But when I am posting on my own TikTok account, I'm basically just like posting for fun, even though technically I'm like promoting the podcast. Most of the time, I'm not posting about the podcast at all. So it's like you're doing it in a different way and allowing yourself to be free. So I do think if you're someone who's like very particular about your own personal brand, you will struggle because you're not doing what I described earlier, which is like using different muscles to paint this similar picture. I don't think that's a very good analogy, but you're not using different muscles. You're in fact using the same. So the issue and sort of the cost there will be that you're basically just adding another client to your roster if you're viewing yourself through this lens of like personal brand instead of just posting as a human being and having a good time. I think that there's like a lot to be said about, again, allowing yourself to be multidisciplined. And there's something hugely different about just posting content for fun versus posting content from a branded point of view. So yeah, personal use, posting just for fun as someone who works in this field, I think is like, to me, becoming a very important and very fun part of the process because it's not pressurized. I'm not making myself another client. I'm just having a good time and getting out there and seeing what people are doing. And it's really inspiring my work with brands in a way that I really didn't anticipate. But yeah, the main takeaway there is if you're going to think of yourself as a brand and you're not going to allow yourself to play, I think that posting from a personal account will get really sticky and difficult for you to maintain because, again, you're basically just onboarding a new client instead of having a good time online. Okay, so the next piece of this I want to talk about is something I see people talk about all the time, which is if you're not watching, I'm doing air quotes, research time on platforms. Oh my goodness. I do this too, so I'm going to hold everyone's hand while I say it. Unstructured research time, when you are simply scrolling, you're not doing anything at all. I do this sometimes where it's like in between calls or something, I'll go on some kind of platform and start scrolling. And in my little heart of hearts, I think I'm doing research. I'm gathering inspo. Nobody can tell me anything. This weird 15-minute interval where I'm like scrolling on TikTok. This is for my job. It's research. Hello. That's not doing anything at all. And I stopped lying to myself about it, and I want you to stop lying to yourself about it too, because I think in my sort of personal experience, when we do that, we start to see our screen time really ramp up, which is not always the best thing. And it's like the more content you're absorbing doesn't necessarily mean you're getting more inspo. I feel like I talk to a lot of other people who work in content or who are social media managers, and they talk specifically about this like phenomena where you just don't remember what you saw because you see so much. So you're scrolling for like, yeah, let's say 15 minutes between calls, and what you'll find is like maybe a couple videos that you save down, but you never actually use them, or you might add a couple audios to your favorite on TikTok, but again, never actually using them. I think it's really important to internally, and even do it like through your calendar, structure time for gathering research versus when you're just scrolling for pleasure. Because, like I mentioned before, I spent like 8 years of my life totally offline on the personal front. It was really easy for me to separate personal versus like professional scrolling because I wasn't doing any personal scrolling. Now it's definitely gotten a little bit murkier, so I have some more sympathy for people who kind of fall into that trap of doing a lot of scrolling. But actually carving out the time, I think, is the most important piece of advice that I don't actually see a lot of. So time blocking yourself like 30 minutes and having a specific goal is really important when you're doing this as well. So again, instead of like opening up Instagram and being like, what is going on Reels, and just like tapping through for hours on end, I think what's really important is to do the work of being a good marketer beforehand, figuring out, all the things we've talked about on the podcast before, which is who are my targeted personas? Who do I actually want this content to hit with? And then you take that information and you think, I would like to find content related to, actually a good example is something I just sort of briefed out for some content creators today, which is I wanted some content creators to make some talking head content in their car. And so I was looking for specific videos of people in their vehicles and different like angles that they're filming at and different ways that they are like presenting themselves in the driver's seat of a car. So I was looking specifically for inspo for that thing. I think that there really isn't ever a situation where I am now going online for like general inspo. That might feel, I don't know, controversial to say. I think a lot of people do it where it's like, okay, let me just, head on Reels, see what people are doing in general. But I have talked about this on the podcast before. A real issue I have is when folks just grab trends from anywhere and apply them to their brands because they're not always necessarily built for your target persona. And I think this tends to happen a lot of the times when people don't understand who their persona actually is, which is something that we think about a lot at Pilot House. Before we even start making content, we want to understand who that content needs to apply to. I recently hopped on All Killer No Filler with Eric. Such a dream. It always feels like going home. That's what I say, like at the holidays after you move out. Going on All Killer No Filler is like a sweet, wholesome event for me now. But yeah, we did a podcast episode about creative diversity specific to Meta's rollout of Andromeda. And I also have talked about creative diversity on this pod before, not specific to Andromeda, but just in general. And so one of the things that we've talked about a lot is how to formulate a persona and a persona-based strategy, because most platforms now, your creative is your best means of targeting, and it's the basically most controlled element that you have at your disposal. It's just like the strongest weapon in your arsenal. I feel like as a pacifist, I don't like saying that, but it is the best way to put it. It's like the most dependable thing you have to get you to that next scale of growth. So it's really important that you understand who you need these ads to hit with, because when you get into that rhythm of just going on TikTok or Instagram, wherever you are, just scrolling, finding trends, and then deploying them on your brand, you're not really using your time or the time of the creators or the time of your designers very effectively. So I really want to make sure that you guys are sort of understanding what I'm saying, and that your research time should be governed by a main goal And if you don't have that goal, if you don't understand who you want to talk to or what kind of trends you should be participating in, you can head over to the Pilot House website and fill out a little lead form, and we can chat about this directly. I like to talk about it a lot and for a long time, so we can really get into it. But yeah, it ends up saving you so much time. Like, I was talking to one of the clients that I work with directly, and we were looking at sort of our framework and deliverables and how much content we're going to be making throughout the month of November. And the deliverable numbers were pretty big. And we were talking about how that used to make us nervous. Like, it was like, how are we going to fill up the ad accounts with hundreds of pieces of content in a single month? And now we make more content than sort of our baseline of testing. We make a ton of stuff, but it's all so measured and it's so based in strategy that we were talking about how the work is a lot easier now. And I think part of it is what I'm talking about here, which is when you are doing research, when you're trying to figure out what style to make next and what to bring into the ad accounts as a whole and what content you want to develop, you're doing it with a guiding light. You're not just going out into the internet, which is a vast, terrifying, awful abyss of content all the time. And so once you have that idea of who you're talking to, you've got your persona strategy on lock, then you understand like what you want to say, and it becomes a lot easier to find inspiration around how to actually say it. So I would say when it comes to like scrolling platforms as a means of research, the true benefits are obviously that you are getting exposure directly to what people are doing, whether that's like from an organic point of view or you're looking at what competitors are doing. You are boots on the ground seeing what's going on these platforms, which will help you make better content. But the cost is, like I just laid out, you can waste a ton of time doing this. And I see people really consistently lose a lot of hours. And I think I hear about this so much because I am someone who has always maintained a really high velocity of creative diversity in an ad account. I've always made a ton of content and it's always been incredibly diverse and incredibly targeted, and it usually works very well. And that is because I have never just gone on, well, not never. I started doing it, as I mentioned before, but I really rarely go on platforms and scroll just for the sake of scrolling and calling it like kind of inspo gathering or research. I'm really targeted about how I use my screen time. And one of those things that I do is I just make sure, like I mentioned in that example, I want to get someone in a car talking about this product, wearing the product. Let me find different instances of people doing that out in the wild. And that is like all I'm looking at content wise. I'm not just scrolling through my own FYP because then I'm going to get distracted by cat videos, and that's not helping anyone. Okay, so the next idea I want to talk about, the next component of this, is how to actually do that targeted persona research. I don't mean like the example I just gave, which was I want to put someone in a car. Let me find examples related to that. I want to talk about the nitty gritty. So like I mentioned, if you don't know who your target personas are at this point in time, call me because I'd love to talk about it and we can figure it out. But if you do have that information, I want to talk about sort of the next step. And I want to use an example of a brand that I used to work with. I was working with a specialty coffee brand. And at that point in time, this is really embarrassing because I have since moved into pulling my own espresso. We have a really cool Breville coffee machine upstairs. If my boyfriend's listening, you are infinitely better at making these coffees. I don't know. I think I'm just not very good at I think it's called tamping, when you're like pushing the beans down in the little espresso puck thing after you grind them. I'm not like totally that good at that. I don't know why. Anyway, so I used to be really easygoing with my coffee. I'm a lot better now. I learned, but I used to be very into just like putting an espresso pot in, lame, and making coffee that way. So I was working with this specialty coffee brand and they really knew about coffee, but more importantly, their customer base really knew about coffee. They knew so much more about coffee than I did. And it was pretty obvious in the way that I would talk about the product versus the way that actual end users would talk about the product. So what I did was I did my homework, I did my research, I put together some personas, and then what I did was I didn't just go on the platforms that I would tend to use. So I guess I was mentioning earlier, like Tumblr, that's so funny to me. I didn't just like go on Tumblr and look up like cafe aesthetic pictures. What I did was I did some deep research into user bases on different platforms. And this is like some real nerdy stuff, but I think it's really important to take the time to understand the actual nuances from platform to platform as a marketer, because if you don't know who's on the platform, you're not going to know strategically when to start advertising or posting on that platform. And you're not also going to know what type of content you should be putting on that platform. So a good example of this as well, I remember a few years ago, we had like a New Year's Eve party and we were supposed to bring trivia about something. And I brought some trivia about TikTok because my partner, again, shout out, is 6 years older than me, and so are his friends, so they weren't really using TikTok. So I was bringing some of my Gen Z TikTok knowledge to them, but also knowledge as an advertiser. And back then, I remember one of the most interesting demographic insights from TikTok for me, which was a large majority of the platform were sort of millennial women, that age category, when most of the time when we make assumptions about TikTok, we assume it's like, now I think people really blur the lines between Gen Alpha and Gen Z, but we assume it's like very young people. But especially when it comes to advertiser insights, a lot of people shopping through TikTok, obviously you have to have money to shop, kids don't have money, we're millennial women. And so there's like a really dangerous assumption that you're making when you assume who's on a platform based on what you think and feel about that platform. It's really important to actually look into, like I said, the demographic data surrounding these platforms. So what I did, going back to my specialty coffee brand example, is I spent more time on Reddit than I have ever spent in my entire life, and more time on Reddit than I think I will ever spend again in my entire life, because that is where their core customer was, and that is where they felt the most at home talking about the product. That is where they showed up really authentically. And so I would read Reddit reviews of not necessarily the product, but I would read Reddit reviews around just coffee experiences in general. So when there was like big events in the space, I would hop on Reddit, read about people's experiences at different conferences or like barista championships. I would read about local cafes in like coffee hubs. And I know this sounds like a lot to do to make advertising material for a brand, but it's really, really important. And so I would go on, like I mentioned, and I would read about how they would like use language to define their experiences, not pertaining to the product that I was trying to sell them, because I really wanted to find a way to engage with them that didn't just feel authentic, but like genuinely was authentic. And I do think scrolling through all that content probably has something to do with me becoming a bit of a coffee snob, but I really like got into their ways. And like I mentioned, I wouldn't necessarily just dive into research around this particular brand and what they sold. I really wanted to understand just how these people communicated about coffee in general, because I tied that into all of our marketing strategy after we really got the main chunk of our personas figured out and we were thinking more deeply about who we were talking to. So that is sort of what I mean when it's like you want to be precise when you're doing your targeted persona research, and you don't just want to hop on TikTok and search coffee review and then the brand name, because that's not necessarily going to be the most authentic end user, and it's not going to necessarily give you the best information. I think there's like so much demand for our attention as marketers. There's so many different things we could be doing. And so I always tell the team at Palette House, I tell any brand I'm working with, it's like we want to make sure we're doing the right work and the right research. And part of that, again, is making sure that we're on the right platforms. Like if you were researching how to sell me something, you'd probably go on a platform like TikTok, because that's genuinely where I spend the most time, or Tumblr, as I've mentioned. We should bring Tumblr back, guys. That's actually the new thesis of this episode. Bring Tumblr back. I think it's really cool. I think it's really fun. I want to reblog GIFs. Okay. I've never seen Doctor Who, but I want to get into Doctor Who. I would get into Doctor Who if it meant Tumblr coming back in a big way. Anyway, you really want to make sure you understand what platforms people are actually using, because that is going to get you the best information the quickest. You're kind of just going down a rabbit hole if you're looking on platforms where people don't actually spend a lot of time, because you're not actually looking at content straight from your targeted persona, straight from the horse's mouth. So really make sure you're being cautious around where you're looking when you're doing that research, because it makes like an actual world of difference. Like I cannot overstate enough how much more value I got from doing those crawls of Reddit threads compared to if I'd gone on Instagram and I was looking at people's aesthetic pictures of their coffee setups. Like it's a totally different person. And yeah, they might both really care about coffee, but they care about coffee in a very different way, and how you speak to them across any vertical, it really does matter. So the benefits obviously to doing like targeted persona research and thinking about how you're showing up online and where you're showing up, and layering in this idea of standpoint theory and thinking, okay, do you belong to different communities online, or are you maybe just staying on LinkedIn and talking to other social media managers and talking to other DTC founders and just sticking in one bubble? It's so important to really broaden your horizons, even if it's like not in the traditional standpoint theory way. And it's just like finding different spaces online to show up in, because it does, like I mentioned, it just becomes easier and you start like snowballing into different communities. So I obviously have like personal interests and communities that I'm part of online because of things that I just as a person, as Aves, like, but because I've done so much research and I do put in the time to really understand each and every brand that I touch, it's like you start to find easier ways to get over the initial work. Because if I talk to anyone else ever again and they are really niche in the coffee space, I know where exactly to find those people. And it's similar to any kind of CPG type of wellness stuff. They're probably going to live in the same places. So you start to see sort of Venn diagrams pop up of different personas and where they like to live and how they both sort of expel and also like let in content into their own lives. So the true benefit is like you just get a better understanding of what these people want to hear and how to talk to them. The cost of that is obviously going to be, in my case, when I was on those Reddit threads, my sanity in a way. But also, I think the cost comes down to just time, because it does take a lot of time to do what I laid out there, which is to like deeply understand and integrate yourself in a community. But I don't know, I guess I'm just an optimist in general. Most of the time when I've like laid out the cost for these different things, whether it's posting online yourself or scrolling to get research, or this, how to do targeted persona research, it's like the benefit always outweighs the cost, in my opinion, for all of these. So it's a small cost, which is just your time. But I don't know, you'd probably spend the time later on in the journey making a ton of content trying to attract these people anyway, and you're just going to be throwing a lot more spaghetti at the wall. So my advice to you is to put up the time up front, figure out what they actually want to see, and then make content off of that. But yeah, I feel like that was sort of a different episode. We've been doing a lot of very tactical episodes about Q4, which we're all in the heat of right now. I'm having the best time of my life. I have come down with a flu. And I'm just rocking with it. I'm just enjoying it. Really like letting the Dayquil set in and having a good time with it, and feeling like maybe it'll add to the creativity in the ads that I make. But yeah, that was a like fun episode to think about and put together. I think that some parting words of wisdom and some words of conclusion for this episode is I think it can be really easy as people who work in either paid social, or you're a founder, or you're just a general kind of organic social media manager. If you are touching the sort of e-commerce space at all, it can be really easy to excuse really high screen times in this industry. And I am someone who likes to get off my frickin' phone and shut the laptop. I started this episode by talking about reading. I'm a big reader. I love to go on walks. I love to spin my vinyl. I love to cook. I love to do things that do not require any screen time at all. And so I think it's really important to think about how you are using these tools for your job and in a personal sense as well, and think about whether or not you're using them strategically and whether or not you're using them in a way that's moving you forward as a marketer, or just sort of wasting your time. Because as we know, as people who work in marketing, they are designed to waste your time. So it's really easy to fall into that trap because we're all looking at all of this stuff all the time. So yeah, I do think I also see a lot of content from peers about like really struggling to cut their screen time down. So hopefully some of these tips and tricks have helped. It has been very interesting for me, again, as someone who spent like 7-8 years completely offline, except for when I was working, to then dive back into like creating content and spending more time like on the internet and on a screen. It's been really interesting. And like I mentioned, I've just seen a lot of people sort of talking about having a hard time cutting down their screen time. And I think it all comes down to, again, like approaching it thoughtfully and strategically and knowing what you're doing on platforms and having a plan instead of letting it just suck up your life. So yeah, that was the episode. It was kind of crazy. Like I mentioned halfway through there, if you are struggling to find your way in terms of putting together who your actual target persona is, you can head over to the Pilot House website and fill out a lead form. And if you say you came from the Ad-venturous podcast, we can chat directly, which is really fun. If you want, we can dive deeper into standpoint theory. Why not? I love it. We can talk about altruism. We can talk about any piece of moral philosophy that you want, because like I mentioned, I think you have to engage in those convos with other people. You can't just like monologue about it. But yeah, thanks so much for listening. I'll talk to you guys next week. Please leave a comment or subscribe or a rating. All of those things are really cool. And yeah, I'll chat to you next week.